what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And it can be easy to get caught in what the person wants and the direction they're going in. And then I think important to help them step back and think, what's the problem that we're trying to solve and who's involved in solving the problem. And we, as the owners, actually the problem. What we're coming with may not be the actual problem.
What was it that makes you think that coaching is useful versus information? So what's the difference between the two?
The key difference around the two is that
Okay, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Emily Carroll, who is practice owner and Project X coach extraordinaire. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Sachin, for having me on here.
Excellent. So, Emily, we'll jump straight into it. It might be useful just in however brief or long you want to make it, but just to give us a glimpse into your journey from practice owner or GP even to practice owner to how and why you became a coach with us in Project X.
Yeah, so Dr. Kristen McLaughlin and I started Pear Tree 9 years ago now with kind of the vision that we wanted to provide the level of care to our patients that we wanted our family to provide. So what we discovered is that we dived in, we had a plan of what was going to happen if we failed. So we had made everything around kind of how much we would need to pay back if we failed. We didn't have a positive plan, but we rapidly realized we'd exceeded our own expectations very quick. And as we were sort of learning more about running a business, we realized how much we didn't know and how much we were stuck and needed help. And so it was sort of around this time that I actually reached out to Todd Cameron, having met him at a conference before, to ask for a little bit of advice around pathology leases. And it was at that time he said that he was just in the beginning of starting something up and that he would be back in touch in a week later. And we had a great conversation a week later around Project X and what it was going to look like. So this was the early days when it was the initial 12-week red pill. And Kristen and I knew that we needed help. We knew that we needed help specific to general practice, and we weren't aware of anything else that was around. So we jumped in and we look back and we call it the best unplanned decision we ever made. And so for us, it's really kind of revolutionized how we think about the business, the impact the business has both in the community and on our own individual lives, and the satisfaction. And so for us, having a group of people that we can ask problems of, that we know are experiencing the same thing, and have either been there or are going to be there in the future, has been incredibly rewarding. And so for me, when the opportunity came to be a coach with Scale My Clinic, I was really keen to get involved because I wanted the opportunity to help other clinics who were sort of joining at the point that we were to be able to then have the enjoyment from their general practice business that we now have.
Nice. Thank you for that summary. And so we've got something else in common that I didn't know about, which is you're a worst case scenario planner, just like me. Just make sure the worst case is covered and we're good. And so you can't help your instincts and they're helpful, right? And so that's a really helpful overview. And obviously you've been here as a coach now in Project X for coming up to 5 years now.
I must say that, yeah, maybe 4, not 100% sure. Yeah. Yep.
A fair while. And so you've spoken to hundreds of owners in that time and seen many go through a similar journey to you. I might just start with a question around what was it that makes you think that coaching is useful versus information? So what's the difference between the two? Because there's information plenty and you can go and get information. What would, in your mind, be the difference between the two?
So I think that the key difference around the two is that you can learn all the information that you want, but the implementation is very different. And what coaching does is really help to kind of move it from learning information to implementing it in your clinic, because of course you can have all the knowledge in the world, but it's not going to make a difference to your business if you can't take those sort of jumps of pain. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes different degrees of pain, but knowing that kind of things are going to be easier at the finish. And also that if you kind of jump into the pain early, the areas that are causing the most amount of bother and problems, actually then down the track you can start jumping into areas of joy and excitement because you've got a team and a vision, a knowledge base of actually how to implement things. So then when you wanted to do something to grow the business or have a positive impact, you know how to do it, and you know that you've got a team that will support you, and that you know that there is no obstacle that you're going to encounter that you can't get support to overcome.
Nice. And so you mentioned pain. One of the things that many owners will think or say even is, I just need to work a bit harder. I just need to do more, and then I'll be okay. But you mentioned something different, which is you need to go for the pain. I'd love to hear a bit more about your perspective on that, and whether that's different to working harder, or joined up with that, or completely separate.
And so I think that the kind of jumping into the pain was a bit of a lesson we learnt, Kristen and I, through trial and error. So with our kind of plan to fail, which in hindsight has actually been very helpful, because we know when someone is perhaps being not honest with the truth, because we've gone there and done it. And so in that, we grew a little bit, and everyone had practice managers, and so we thought we needed a practice manager, and we encountered someone who had more knowledge than us leading up to accreditation and thought they were the right person. And then I guess with time we came to learn more and went to implement more, and what we realized in doing that was that perhaps they were not the right person and were actually undoing our systems and having a negative impact. And so the easy thing would have been just to stick our head in the sand and kind of think, well, we've got someone that's a little bit further ahead than what we were. But instead, kind of, we chose to lean into the pain and decided that this was not the right person, not the right setup for us, and actually tackled it. And I think the lesson I've learned since then is, every time we have had an inkling that something isn't quite right and not lent hard enough into the pain of sorting it, particularly as a people person problem, the more pain it's actually caused down the track. So the longer we've let it go, the worse the situation has been at the end. And so I think it's that when clinics kind of join for coaching, often they'll have lots of sort of pain points happening, and particularly if it's staff related, which is a really common one when people join, that kind of support to lean into the pain, knowing that they've got a HR help desk that they can go to every fortnight, knowing that they can come along and talk, in the implementation sessions, so kind of a much smaller group that they can share on the Facebook group. And I think the big thing is knowing that you're not alone. Do you know what I mean? That these are common problems, that it's a skill in learning to deal with them, but also I think thinking differently. So most clinic owners are GPs, and as GPs we're taught to, accommodate the patient, to work with them at where they are and support them along, and that ultimately the patient gets the choice. Whereas as a GP owner, it's a very different, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a very different mindset around the fact that we want to be supportive of our staff, but we don't want the clinic to revolve around one staff member's needs. And so making that kind of mindset shift has had a big impact in how we've sort of led and managed and helped our staff grow. But also that fact that when we would realise that all of a sudden everything was being done around what was right for the person versus right for the business, that actually tackling that was just causing more pain down the track.
Nice. One of my old coaches, Scott Harris, he had this phrase which was feather, brick, truck, especially around people. So first you get tickled with a feather that something's not right, which is your inkling. Then you might get hit by a bit of a brick, which is, someone having a bit of a meltdown, or as my 13-year-old would say, a crash out. And then the truck, which is the toxic behavior or some other big incident. And I agree. We all know when that feather is tickling us, but it's easy to ignore it. But we're just lining up for the brick and then the truck if we don't. That's super useful. So we might move forwards. You deal with obviously many owners. As part of Project X, over the years you've been working as a coach, you'll have met hundreds. We might just start with, sometimes people come with a surface goal. I need more GPs, or I need to bill more. But often, it's a bit like with patients. We might think we need something, but what we actually need is something else. So wants and needs, probably. We want one thing, but actually we need something else. Can you talk to me a bit about that? Like, going below just the surface?
So I think it's quite interesting when people come to the help desk around kind of remembering to use the question of what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And it can be easy to sort of get caught in what the person wants and the direction they're going in. And then I think important to kind of help them step back and think, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And who's involved in solving the problem, and we as the owners actually the problem. And it can be useful because I think that again, if we come back to that, as GPs we look at the layers of things, but in business we're not really taught, well, we're not taught as GPs how to run business. And so until you sort of start working with people as members do in Project X and hearing their stories, then we learn from each other around the fact that what we're coming with may not be the actual problem. So I guess in the help desk, it can be hearing what people are saying is the main pain point, but then delving down under that as to what is or isn't happening. For example, people might have lots of pain points around admin staff, but actually when we delve into it, it's more of an organisational structure problem, or people don't have clarity about what their job is, or there's not a proper meeting cadence in place, or the accountability steps are not there, or people are falling back into a role that's not theirs. So practice manager doing reception being on leave. Yeah, so it's kind of that stepping back and helping people look at their clinic overall in helping them kind of guide to reach their key pain point.
So it's a bit like, if we think of a medical analogy, symptoms versus diagnosis. Would that be a fair analogy?
It is, you're right. And the best one I think to think of there is iron deficiency. Do you know what I mean? Someone comes to you and they're deficient in iron, but that's not actually the diagnosis. The diagnosis is what's causing the iron deficiency. And so it's the same way here, is that people come with a problem, but we actually need the diagnosis and the cause tackled. And often that's a different approach to just targeting the problem. So for example, just giving iron versus finding someone's bowel cancer.
Absolutely. And obviously if you just did one of those, you might be moving towards danger, right? And so when we get it right, once we take the time working with, in this case, the Project X member, we unpack and work out a likely diagnosis and what happens next? So, we found the diagnosis, what do we do?
So I think it sort of depends what stage they're at. So when people join Project X, there's sort of now Foundations X involved to sort of help kind of contain the overwhelm, because often when people join Project X, things are in a little bit of point of crisis. There's so many things to tackle, and then there's so many great resources that it's easy to sort of just start doing a little bit of everything. And so I guess once those kind of foundation knowledge is down, then it's using a mix of the coach helping do your initial 6-week game plan, and then using the help desk to kind of keep the momentum going. So what people will normally get the most out of coaching if they commit to doing the help desks each week, particularly when they're new to Project X, because again, it's that helping to discover what's the real cause of the pain, but also really provides an opportunity to learn from each other in kind of a smaller group, because no matter what the topic is, everyone has an experience and something to contribute, and it's through that we kind of all learn from each other and take steps to improve. And I also think that kind of engaging in those smaller groups of help desk helps people to build their confidence in being vulnerable and asking for help, and knowing that there's no stupid questions and they're not alone, and that we've got lots of resources that can help, but that also the coach desk, the help desk, provides a little bit of accountability. So for some people, they are excellent, as we said before, at acquiring knowledge, but then actually looking at delegating and implementing it out is hard, because sometimes in doing that, you're actually going to be tackling those pain points and realizing that the accountability isn't there, and so it's easier to just sit acquiring information. So the help desk, by kind of committing to that, really provides sort of a form of accountability to really get members and teams going. And what people normally find is that then by following the process, then they can kind of adjust it to their own style as they go along.
Got it. And so what we're talking about is obviously taking time to unpack and get to a diagnosis, and then just committing to a regular cadence of especially at the initial phases, coming in this case to a help desk, which you run obviously once a week, and Stevie runs once a week. Coming there, sharing progress, using that as a place to be accountable, being vulnerable and open, in that setting and sharing what's going well and maybe the barriers that are faced, so that you can keep momentum going, is what I'm hearing. And so the key is momentum, and momentum linked to small actions that build up over time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So momentum. And I think also is maybe knowing your own capacity. So what can happen is that people can kind of dive in, and some people are great at having a number of problems and projects happening, and other people are not. And so the help desk is a really good way of kind of working out where people's capacity sits and helping guide them to realize where it sits. And also, I think that Project X saying of progress over perfection. So, as doctors, often we're perfectionistic, we're perfectionists. And so, helping people to kind of realize that it doesn't matter what the first version looks like, something is better than nothing, and that they can keep improving on it over time. And I think the other thing where the help desk is useful is that there's so much information that comes through Project X that it can be tricky to know where to start if you're a new member, and it can be sometimes tempting to dive into the end result without sort of making sure that the steps beforehand are in place. And so the help desk and kind of engaging with the team is a really good way to make sure that you are actually, as we said, tackling the cause of the iron deficiency, not kind of looking just at the outcome.
Absolutely. And so when you've seen that, play out well, and you've seen many people go through that process, what are some breakthroughs that you've seen that you've really enjoyed?
So I can think of a couple of clinics that I've really enjoyed working with. And in all cases, the breakthrough has been that they've been willing to have really tough conversations, and that they've been really willing to lean into the pain, but also that they've had a vision. Do you know what I mean? They've had a vision of what they want it to look like, and what sort of they want to happen. And for them, it has usually been around them realizing that the team is not the right team to achieve that vision, and that in order to get the right team, there is going to be some pain in there. And I guess they've been willing to sort of have the difficult conversations, because these conversations are uncomfortable. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not, none of us find conflict easy, and often having these difficult conversations involves a degree of conflict, supportive conflict and disagreements, but nonetheless sort of conflict. And that's very different again to what we're used to as GPs. And so it takes time and confidence to build, and also sort of learning that the behavior you walk past is the behavior that you're willing to accept, and actually having the courage then to call that out at the particular time, rather than just ignoring it. So yeah, the clinics where I've kind of seen the biggest impact have sort of tackled those. The other clinics that have had enormous impact is where there's been one person willing to lead the team. And sometimes I do think that has been to their detriment if the rest of the owners won't get involved. But for that actual individual that is willing to lead the team and make progress, their individual growth and knowledge is huge. And so clinics have had amazing results when that's been the case. And yeah, and it's been really great to kind of watch those people often just working away in the background, and then they'd appear, they'd get stuck, they'd ask for help, and then sort of, work through the materials in the background. But I think the key thing when people are having big outcomes and big changes is that there's just constant slow work happening in the background.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, number one, be willing to have the tough conversations. And then number two, constant improvement and iteration and small steps over a period of time. You don't have to do everything in one go. And then number three, although it came earlier in what you shared, is not walking past lower standards than you expect. Then number four, which was again in a different order to which you gave me, was just being clear on your vision and what you want. And so if we talk about conversations that change, that make real lasting change, because I think the tough conversations, you were very clear, is one of the most important factors. As a GP, we have very strong identities, and we're very much about being caring, kind, compassionate for those that we care for, like medically. And then we have a different hat as a leader, but it's hard to release that identity of being the kind, caring sort of fixer who's there to help. What have you seen effective in sort of having those conversations? And maybe, people who've been a bit fearful or scared or reticent to have those conversations, like, how have you been able to help or support or assist? And when that's happened, what's been the outcome, and what's been your reflection from your perspective, as a coach?
And so I think it's possible for us to actually have these conversations in a gentle, kind, caring way. And I think the first thing for sort of owners to do is actually just to sit down with the person who's causing the problem. If they're a direct report to the owner, okay, so if the person causing the difficulty is a direct report, then I think it's important the owner sits down with them and sort of has more of that inquiring approach. So a bit like we do when we're doing motivational interviewing, you want to sit down with someone and just sort of hear and inquire and kind of get what their perspective is. Because if we assume most of the time people want to do a good job, then often what it is that there's other things going on that are sort of impacting and preventing it. And that first conversation also helps to get a really good vibe of which way you're going to have to go. And then through having that conversation, there's a way to kind of set goals. So lifting that accountability very gently and sort of seeing if the person meets it. Because if the accountability is there and they start knowing what's expected of them and they meet it, then that's a fantastic outcome to your solution, to your situation, because you kind of don't need to go through the process of performance management. But if you kind of start raising that accountability and the person is not prepared to participate, not prepared to kind of, match what's on their position description, then the longer then you start avoiding the problem and stop having those conversations, the worse it's going to get. So a lot of the time, just lifting the accountability helps people realize whether or not this is the position they want. At the start, I said make sure that the person's a direct report to you, because so for example, say there's someone who's causing problems in the administrative team and you have a practice manager. Actually, the practice manager needs to be coached to have the difficult conversation because they're the direct report. So then as an owner, you almost have kind of two steps to tackle down. And so in that case, I would actually encourage to have the conversation with the practice manager to find out what they've noticed, what they've tried, and what as an owner you can do to support that, because depending on their experience and their personality, they may not have had these difficult conversations before. And then in looking at that, it's also a bit of an opportunity to help the practice manager look at where the accountability and responsibility is falling within their department. So I think we can definitely have confrontative conversations in a gentle way so that everyone walks away feeling okay, or at least with a plan. And I think in those confrontive conversations, it's also trying not to take anything personally. So, as doctors, it's very unpleasant if the patient leaves feeling, angry, and we're very aware of that. And then I guess in our role as owners, it is acknowledging that people can express their anger, but that it's not directed personally. And so, for example, sometimes as an owner with a doctor, it can be a matter just of sitting and listening and letting them kind of convey their anger and frustration, but also accepting that sometimes that's their cultural and personality background and that they're not necessarily angry at you directly, but angry at a situation. And so it's the same thing when we're sort of tackling our staff, is trying to differentiate what's happening personally, what's a personal directed at us as opposed to the situation, and really trying to focus in tackling these problems and these conversations on the situation. So there are a couple of tools that within Project X that we sort of direct members to help them sort of have these conversations. And like everything, the more you practice doing it, the less scary it becomes and the easier it is to tackle it early on.
Nice. And when you've seen people, who maybe were a bit worried or fearful or concerned about having the conversation, what in your experience has been the aftermath? Like, you've probably caught up with them after, or they've come to the help desk to report back, this is what happened. What have you seen or observed, or what reflections do you have on people who've then gone ahead and had the conversation?
So usually when someone's gone ahead and had a conversation with, particularly if it's someone else in the clinic in a leadership role that isn't performing in a satisfactory way, normally once the person's had the difficult conversation and perhaps performance managed that person out, or the person has had a turnaround in behaviour, normally what happens is, one, these owners feel much better, but often actually the team feels much better, because usually the team is kind of aware of what's going on. It's unpleasant for the team is feeling dissatisfied, don't want to come to work, but they're kind of too afraid to say things. But sort of as those conversations start to happen, the team feels more confident to share, and particularly if there's someone toxic in the workplace who conversations have been had and that person has chosen to move on, usually owners will hear from the team that, there'd been a lot of other stuff going on, but the team was in fact very supportive of the owners and the direction. And so in these conversations, there has usually only been a sense of relief after. And then usually these clinics have made amazing progress with kind of getting their team on board and the sense of culture and the enjoyment for everyone.
Nice. And so they've effectively removed or turned an obstacle around. And so that's super useful. Thanks, Emily. We might just talk a bit about community. So obviously, in our situation in Project X, community is a big part of the work we do, and an integral part of many of the successes had by many of the practices that are in Project X. What, from your perspective, you've probably got two perspectives, I think, because you're in the community and you're a coach in Project X. So it'd be really interesting just to understand your reflections, especially over 6+ years, we were just saying before we started recording today. You've seen it change and evolve. What's the power of community from with both your hats?
So I think if I think of it as an owner, the real power of community is being able to reach out to people who have either experienced the same thing before, they're going through it, or knowing that kind of it's, if they haven't encountered that problem yet, they'll probably will in the future. So it feels far less isolating. Do you know what I mean? You know, you're surrounded by people that are going through the difficulties of general practice at the same time, but often people are just at different stages of it. And so if I think back when we first joined, we got the most amount of impact through asking lots and lots of questions. And I think that kind of the more questions you ask when you join, the more you get out of it. And I think in a lot of ways, it was very easy when we first joined to ask lots of questions because there were far few members. And I think now that sometimes when people join, they can feel maybe even a little bit intimidated at time because it seems like you've got clinics involved that sort of, have seem much more together and ahead. And usually that is just because they've actually delved into the pain in the past and asked all the questions and sort of been where that person is before. And so the more vulnerable that you're willing to be when you jump in initially and the more questions you ask, the more you'll get out of it. And I think also that sometimes the nice thing about the breakout rooms or the help desks is that people are more likely to be vulnerable. So sometimes people can ask questions on the Facebook group, but people aren't willing to share, whereas they may be more willing to share their personal experience in the smaller groups. And so that's where kind of there's a really nice range of options that people can go to sort of get the most out of it. But yeah, my big advice as being a member of our clinic is ask lots of questions. The best learning comes from asking from people who've walked there before. I guess then as a coach, it's trying to help people know that they can ask lots of questions and that there is no question that is silly and that, everyone has been there before and that if we can't give the direct answer in the help desk, that we can either find it or create the resource or people can ask others in the community. And I think that in terms of kind of what one gets out of it, if I think back on kind of major changes in general practice, being with a group of people that sort of are proactively tackling them has made them all easier. So if I think back to COVID and the huge number of changes that were happening, being involved in Project X meant that we were on the forefoot. So we were tackling things. So again, not as opposed to avoiding the pain, we were actually kind of tackling things proactively. And then again, coming in with the recent GP CCMP changes, it was kind of really looking at it strategically and how does it match with the clinic's direction. And if I think back on COVID and the benefits of sort of what we got from being involved in the clinic, it was actually the fact that we'd lent in and we'd asked the questions and we'd made some hard choices and we'd learnt a lot and then implemented that in order to move to another clinic that gave us facility to grow, but also reduced some of our significant fixed costs. And without doing that beforehand, I don't think as a clinic we would have survived COVID and that we would have folded. And so it really stands for me as that kind of big example and learning point that you kind of got to ask the questions, challenge the knowledge that you have, and that's the way to get the most out of it. So I guess keeping that in mind, then when working with members, it's really trying to get them to kind of challenge every little bit as they're thinking about it and not kind of assume that nothing can't be changed.
Absolutely. And so one thing that you mentioned in there that I think is quite important, and maybe in our medical training or maybe even in other online groups, if we ask questions, you can often be shot down in traditional medical environment and sometimes in online groups, maybe unfiltered, you can get either unhelpful responses or just people trying to make you feel stupid. And so I think being in a curated group and then having courage or developing courage just to be open, because it's a new muscle almost, of courage muscle, because we're often taught just to grit your teeth and get on with it. Talk to us maybe about that, like how overcome the barrier maybe that may be there around maybe being judged about asking a question, or people will think I'm stupid, or everyone's better than me, and I'm just a small fish, all those types of things that we might think. What's the reality?
So, I mean, the reality is very different. So, this is a group of people that all want owner-led, so small owner-led general practices to do well. And so there's not a level of arrogance. So there is a group of people who all know that there's so much they don't know, and know that any of us could be in the other person's situation any day. And so that creates kind of a real willingness to be supportive, as opposed to some of the other attitudes that can exist out there towards owners. And I think if I reflect back on some of the sessions we've done and some of the input and reflections members have given, it's often because we're willing to challenge ourselves, and we don't think that we're always right, and we don't think that our way is the only way, and that people sometimes have that sense of inferiority or being an imposter. But actually, within a group setting, that can actually be quite a positive thing, because people are willing to show their vulnerability and kind of realize that they might feel like an imposter, but hey, there's a whole lot of group of other people that are doing the same thing as you and having successes like your clinic is having, and we're in the same place that you were. So yeah, so it's always felt like a very safe place. It's always felt like a place where questions are always answered respectfully. There's never any criticism of other clinics, and that makes a big difference. Do you know what I mean? Whereas kind of you post on other groups somewhere and kind of, people can end up leaving those conversations feeling very negative about themselves. But also I think about the situation and what's going to happen. So it's very easy to get kind of tied up into the narrative that general practice is terrible and failing, and, we're going to end up with capitate. It's going to kind of end up in a terrible place and be taken over by a whole lot of less qualified people. But I think that instead this group provides a positive environment to actually think about what are the strengths of general practice, what are the things that we do well, what are the ways in which we can do it better, and actually kind of makes our clinics then stand out, and patients recognise the skill and care that their GP can provide versus other clinicians stepping into the role. And I think it's one of those things as GPs, if you do something well, right, you make it look easy. So as GPs, we do general practice really well, so we make it look easy. And so whereas in Project X as a group of owners, we know that it's not easy, but we're with a group of people that are prepared to be vulnerable about the fact that it isn't easy, but support each other to make it better.
Nice. I like that as a nice summary at the end. And so over your time coaching, obviously you've helped and answered questions and asked questions of hundreds of practices. But there's probably some journeys you've seen that really stick out for you, that you've really enjoyed. Obviously, in a de-identified manner, is there a story or two that you might be able to share with us that you've seen that you really enjoyed watching the transformation?
Yes, I think one of my favourites ones is someone who joined as a very small clinic. They had issues in staffing. So very common situation, joining small clinics, struggling to recruit and grow, issues with staffing. But they were willing to lean into that, and they were willing to ask for help, and they were willing to come along to sessions and do the hard work. And the key thing that stands out in my mind is that person said they had a vision. Right, they had a vision of what they wanted to achieve, but they didn't have a team around them that in their clinic that wanted to go in that direction. So they didn't have anyone who was willing to help make the changes to get to that vision, and instead they were blocking it. And what that person did was have some difficult conversations, which resulted in a change in leadership. And it's really lovely to look years later now and see the amazing success that they've achieved and the way they've transformed as a leader, and the way their clinic now sort of matches with what their vision is. So that's someone in their clinic that I sort of look at and brings me a lot of joy in terms of kind of the fact that they've been able to achieve what their vision is and the impact that that's then had. Yeah, so that's sort of one situation that particularly stands out in my mind. But I think the other great thing about coaching and being involved is actually hearing what people's visions are and actually helping them to kind of meet that. And I think sometimes when we say like, oh, what's your vision for your clinic, it can be really hard to sort of actually know what that is. And I think perspective of both coach and owner is that sometimes you can't plan that far ahead and you don't know what that vision is. But that, we can just look at what are the pain points, what do you want it to be like a year from now, and just work towards that. And that as people sort of work towards their smaller visions, often the bigger ones become apparent.
Absolutely. It's a bit like driving in fog.
Oh, well, I'm from Australia, so I've never had that experience.
Melbourne here, we get a bit of fog in the mornings, and when it's thick pea soup fog, then you sort of guided by looking at as far as you can see, and then you come out of the fog, and then you can look further into the distance. And so when you're in the quagmire sometimes in business, it's a bit like that, right? You just need to go as far as you can see, get to that, and then suddenly clarity follows. That's been awesome, Emily. So I suppose my last question to you would be, if you had a time machine and there was no butterfly effect or ripple effect or whatever we want to call it, and you got back in your time machine and went back to Emily maybe 7 years before today, what's some advice you would give that sort of person who was 2 years into practice ownership, enthusiastic, had a backup plan if anything went wrong? But what advice would you give, knowing what you know now and the experiences and learnings you've had over that time?
So I think one of the things that I would tell myself is to have a more positive plan. Does that make sense? To actually perhaps aspire for the clinic to be a little bit more than what it started as, or what we could perhaps see in the future. So your analogy of fog. So yeah, Adelaide plain mainlands, we don't have fog, but I need to come to Melbourne and drive in some fog. But that real analogy of we could only see very close, we could only kind of see the immediate future. And so I think if I go back, I would tell myself to look a little bit further into the distance, to set some goals around that future. But I also know that the person that I was 70 years ago didn't have the knowledge to necessarily have been able to do that at the time, or have had the business knowledge to be willing to take the risk. On the flip side, one of the things that I also think back and is positive at the time is that we jumped into practice ownership without being paralyzed by knowing too much. So I also think that if maybe we knew as much as what we know now that we did then, maybe we would never have taken the leap. And so when I look back on that decision 9 years ago, I'm proud of us for taking the leap. But yes, I do look back and tell myself that maybe we could have been a little bit more positive about the outcome.
There's that, dream bigger, be okay to ask for a bit more, but also you need to get started somewhere. And so what I like with what you just shared is there's a bit of both, right? It's you jumped in, you got into the game, and then things progressed and you realize actually we can do more than we thought. And it's not just, minimize the risk. There's build for potential and opportunity. And so I think what you've distilled is actually super useful for anyone in their journey, because it's right what you said. If you do know too much, you can be paralyzed by analysis or paralyzed by fear and never get started. And so kudos to both of you for starting on that journey and then accelerating it. It's been really nice to see. Emily, you've shared some real great wisdom over the last 45 minutes or so. If there's one message you could give to a general practice owner who's watching this, maybe the practice isn't doing what they want for themselves, what they want it to do for them, or maybe they're struggling to achieve a particular goal, or they've hit a plateau. If there's 1, 2, or 3 bits of advice you could give, what would they be?
So I think the first bit of advice I would say is get your team involved. Okay, so this is not something that you can do on your own. You need to get your team involved, and if your team is not right, your second thing needs to be to challenge your team. But then I think my third piece of advice is actually reach out to other owners, go to the RSCGP Practice Owners conference, reach out to other resources, obviously Project X being another one, and ask for help. Do you know what I mean? And start asking the key questions, because what people in doing that will either discover that there's lots of help out there, or they're not alone. Everyone, do you know what I mean, may be in the same situation. But yes, my big advice would be ask lots of questions, get your team involved, and delegate. Make sure that you're not actually the block to kind of making progress.
Awesome. And my takeaway message is you don't have to tolerate where you're at. If you're not happy, you can 100% change it. You just have to be honest with yourself and those around you that you want change. Dr. Emily Carroll, practice owner and coach extraordinaire in Project X. Thank you so much. It's been super valuable.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for having me, Sachin.